Recently, I went to see the Kane Parsons Backrooms movie on its opening night here in the US. Now, going into the theater, my expectations were kept at a medium level. I wasn't expecting the movie to be terrible, but I wasn't expecting anything amazing to come from a movie that was based essentially off of a meme on the internet. And that's fine. This was, after all, an indie film being directed by a first time 19-year-old director. Now, the first half of the movie opens with found footage from the Backrooms. We get to see the perspective of a scientist or some kind of researcher of some sort who was lost in the Backrooms. After a few minutes of this character wandering through the halls, we catch a glimpse of some kind of entity in the shadows. We see a vague glimpse of something that clearly isn't human before it pursues and kills the scientist character off screen. Now, after this point, we are introduced to the actual main characters. Clark, the owner of a failing discount furniture store, and Mary, Clark's therapist. So, Clark is a pretty troubled guy. From what we understand, he was kicked out of his house by his wife, and he's currently sleeping in the store. We get more of an understanding of Clark's psychology and why his wife kicked him out as he's talking with Mary during a therapy session. We get to understand that Clark has a lot of serious personality issues and maybe even a lot of mental issues, which is probably the reason why his wife kicked him out in the first place. Eventually, Clark ends up discovering a portal into the mysterious dimension, which the audience knows as the Backrooms, inside the basement level of his store. As Clark is exploring the back rooms, we get the hint that there is some kind of entity in there pursuing him. And after successfully escaping from this entity, which we still have yet to see on camera, Clark ends up returning to the back room several more times to map out the entire area before he returns to Mary during the next therapy session, where he tries to explain to her what he found. Now, obviously, Mary thinks he's having some kind of mental breakdown, understandably. I mean, imagine someone tells you that, hey, I just found this massive underground complex in my store and there's a portal that leads into it. Obviously, she thinks he's having a mental breakdown. So Clark, frustrated with this, decides that he's going to go back into the back rooms and film it and show her the footage. In order to do this, Clark employs the help of two college students, Bobby and Kat, to help him film inside the back rooms. Now, after he manages to get Bobby and Kat to enter into the back rooms with him, they start filming for a while before Bobby is captured and killed by this unseen entity, before the same entity proceeds to hunt down Kat and Clark through the back rooms. Now, this is the point in the film where we actually first get a somewhat clear glimpse of what the entities look like. As Clark is running through the back rooms from the big main entity, there are several other entities he encounters, and we get to see somewhat of what they look like. However, they are still mostly concealed by shadows, so we still don't know exactly what it is we're looking at. Now, by the second act of the film, it seems that Clark has been missing for quite some time, maybe several days, maybe weeks, and Mary ends up trying to look for Clark by entering his store. And after entering the store and looking around a bit, she actually finds the portal into the back rooms. Now, this is where I think the story starts to fall off. So I guess at some point, Clark ends up going crazy and he either kills the girl Kat or some entity kills her, and he ends up capturing Mary and tying her up. And this is where we first actually get a clear glimpse of what the entities actually are. It's revealed at this point that the entities in the back rooms are basically humans. Clark explains to Mary that the backrooms seem to be some kind of copy of reality, but it's a bad copy, it's flawed. The entities are a result of the backrooms attempting to make a copy of human beings. Now, these entities do superficially resemble humans, however, they are incredibly deformed, with some having like multiple eyes or multiple faces, and one of them is even fused to furniture. It reminds me almost of how AI a few years ago would generate images of humans that were clearly very off, since these early AI models didn't really understand human anatomy. They didn't really understand what made something a human. And in that way, the backrooms, at least Kane's version of it, seems to function similarly to AI, where the backrooms are trying to recreate reality, but it simply lacks the understanding or context to recreate it one for one. So instead, everything in the back rooms is either deformed or distorted from its original form. So after Clark captures Mary, she wakes up in what appears to be the back rooms version of Clark's house. and he has her tied up to a chair at a dinner table. He starts to speak to her as if she is actually his wife, and this seems to be Clark's attempt to sort of cope with the trauma of his relationship. He basically forces Mary to play the role of his wife, and he argues with her in order to justify his actions back in the real world. Now, during this interrogation, Mary convinces Clark that while he is a flawed individual, he doesn't have to change if he doesn't want to. Clark accepts this and decides to free Mary, realizing that while he is flawed, he can remain in the back rooms and he doesn't have to change. Now, at this point, another entity walks into the room. Now, this is the big bad entity that we only saw in the shadows for most of the movie, and it's revealed that this is the Backrooms version of Clark. This entity, unlike the others, is significantly more intimidating. It's like 11 feet tall, and it ends up killing Clark by biting into his neck and then basically ripping him apart before chasing Mary through the back rooms before she is eventually rescued by scientists from the company called Async, which in Kane's lore is the organization responsible for discovering and studying the back rooms. Now, I was a little bit disappointed towards the end of the second act, one, because I didn't like the outcome of what the entities were, and that's just a personal opinion. Also, from this point on, the movie does kind of end abruptly. Mary is interrogated by a scientist working for the company before the movie just abruptly ends. And we really don't get any clear explanation for what the Backrooms actually are or what this company is actually doing here. Which is fine if you actually already knew the lore of Kane's Backrooms, since there is already a ton of background info online on his YouTube channel with all his previous Backrooms videos. But for someone who knows nothing about the Backrooms prior to this movie, I can understand why it can seem somewhat confusing and even disappointing that we never actually get an explanation of what this company is or how they actually discovered the Backrooms. Now, the Backrooms has been receiving a lot of negative backlash online, and a big portion of this criticism is directed towards the second act, especially the ending, which, as I said, is very understandable since if you are someone who doesn't have any prior knowledge of the Backrooms, it's kind of confusing to what's actually going on in the ending. However, it does seem that there is another large subset of people, particularly young people, who are criticizing the Backrooms movie mainly because it doesn't actually fit what they imagine the Backrooms to be. Now, to understand why that is, we first have to go back to the original origins of the Backrooms. So the Backrooms started off as basically just a single post on 4chan containing a photo with a accompanying text caption. So the original Backrooms post is a photo of what appears to be some kind of hallway, maybe in an office building, with fluorescent lights on the ceiling and yellow carpeting and wallpaper. Along with this photo is text saying, "If you are not careful and you no-clip out of reality in the wrong areas, you will end up in the Backrooms, where it's nothing but the stink of old moist carpet, the madness of mono yellow, the endless background noise of fluorescent lights at maximum humbuzz, and approximately 600 million square miles of randomly segmented empty rooms to be trapped in. God save you if you hear something wandering around nearby, because it sure as hell has heard you." For a long time, this is all the Backrooms really was. It was just this post with this image and the accompanying text. Now, eventually, at some point, people did start to make found footage videos inspired by the Backrooms. A lot of them originally were made on Source. And from this point on, we got to see a lot more being added on to the Backrooms and a lot of different interpretations. At this time, there was also another type of media that was trending online called liminal spaces. And a lot of these liminal spaces that we saw online actually got incorporated into the developing Backrooms lore as extra parts of the Backrooms. Now, initially, the only entities that existed in the original Backrooms were actually little more than just the implication that you might not be the only thing in the Backrooms, and that was it. However, as the Backrooms lore began to expand and actually become its own universe, we got to see more people coming up with all sorts of monsters to inhabit the Backrooms, some of them actually somewhat scary, but others being incredibly ridiculous. As the Backrooms began to gain popularity, it developed its own fan base, its own wiki, basically became its own expanded universe similar to the SCP Foundation. And as this happened, it began to move into other forms of media, particularly video games. A lot of Backrooms minigames began to pop up on Roblox, and eventually people even started making standalone horror games set within the Backrooms. As the Backrooms were gaining popularity, they began to reach younger audiences who didn't really understand the subtlety or the existential horror presented by the original Backrooms. Understandably so, because when you're a child, your concept of what is scary is usually not something existential. When you're a child, what's scary is usually just very in your face, like a big monster screaming at you and running after you. So understandably, as more children began to get involved in the Backrooms lore, we saw it move away from that existential horror into more in-your-face, almost slapstick-style horror. I would say by around 2022 or 2023, the Backrooms had moved completely, almost, away from the subtle horror into essentially brain rot. The Backrooms became this wacky, horror-themed amusement park with thousands of diverging and different levels and wacky monsters, and it really wasn't even scary anymore. In some ways, it almost seemed kind of fun to be in there. And this is where I think a lot of the unfounded criticism is coming from for the Backrooms movie. From a lot of the reviews I've seen from people in Gen Z and Gen Alpha on social media, it seems like a lot of people are just disappointed that there weren't other levels or entities like they expected. It really shows that a lot of the people who watched this movie only knew the Backrooms from the brain rot Gen Alpha Roblox version and not from what the original concept of the Backrooms actually was. So for those of you who might not understand this yet, the Roblox brain rot version of the Backrooms with all the different levels and monsters that you may be familiar with is not the original Backrooms. The original Backrooms was essentially just this post on 4chan. All this extra stuff like the pool rooms and the slides and all these other thousands of levels that were added on is not part of what the Backrooms originally was. The original Backrooms didn't have wacky monsters roaming the halls. That wasn't where the scariness came from. It wasn't even certain that there was a monster even in the Backrooms. The horror came from the fact that you could just glitch out of reality and just end up in this uncanny dimension and just be stuck there forever. And sure, there was the implication that you might not be alone in there, but that was simply just an add-on to what was initially just a very scary concept on its own. Now look, I'm not saying we have to be super elitist about what the original Backrooms were. Obviously, there wasn't much to really go off if you're just making a movie based solely off of 4chan posts, because all it was just a shit post at the end of the day. And sure, it's cool that people have expanded on it. I just think that the way people have expanded on it isn't necessarily in line with what originally made it scary. Now, obviously, Kane's version of the Backrooms is not the original Backrooms either. However, I defend Kane's version of the Backrooms because it is more true to the original concept of the Backrooms, of what made it scary. It still relies on a lot of that mystery, on that ambiguity, on a lot of that existential horror, which was really lost as the Backrooms began to mutate as it became more popular. Understanding this, you could even argue that Kane's version of the Backrooms is a sort of meta-commentary on itself. The core theme of the Backrooms movie is memory, specifically about how our memory of certain events changes over time. And this is reflected in the very nature of the Backrooms themselves being a distorted memory of reality. Not only that, but the Backrooms as we know them today is itself a distortion of the original concept. The Kane Parsons Backrooms, as well as the brain rot version, are both, in their own way, distorted memories of the original Backrooms concept. And this is reflected in the younger members of the audience who don't even remember what the original version of the Backrooms even was. The majority of the audience only remembers a version of the Backrooms that is essentially a copy of a copy of a copy of the original. And that's not just the brain rot version, but even the Kane Parsons version. It is just a copy, a misremembering, in a sense, of the original idea. The original image of the Backrooms evoked a very vague and difficult to describe feeling, the sensation of recognizing a place you've never actually been to. Over time, the mysterious nature of the original Backrooms was replaced with lore, monsters, factions, and sprawling narratives that removed any mystery the original concept actually had. The modern Backrooms community may have become trapped within its own Backrooms. The original concept of the Backrooms has been buried beneath different layers of interpretation and reconstruction. To find the original source of the Backrooms, you have to navigate through countless distorted versions, each slightly different from the other, and each not necessarily representing what the original version actually was. And when you look at the real world, you can see that these problems aren't unique to just fans of this niche horror series. These same problems are occurring in every aspect of modern life. I think that our society is really experiencing a fracturing of reality where people see not only the modern world, but even the past in vastly differing ways. This has really picked up since the late 2010s with the rise of social media and the culture wars and everyone suddenly being inside their own little echo chamber. And it's increased tenfold since the pandemic to the point where people can't even agree on events that happened during the pandemic or events that really happened within the last 30 years. Gen Z and younger generations especially are experiencing so many different interpretations of reality and historical events to the point where nobody knows what's true or false. A good example of this would be the discourse around World War II. For a long time, there was a pretty clear, mostly unified understanding of the events of World War II. However, in the last few years, there really has been a rise in vastly diverging perspectives about the war, about the events that occurred during the war, and many of the major figures involved. I think another good example would be AI. With the rise of AI over the last few years and the increasing advancement of AI technology to the point where AI videos are almost indistinguishable from real life, it's really warped most people's perceptions of reality to where most people aren't even sure if a video they're looking at is actually real or not. I mean, there's no way you can tell anymore with how advanced AI has gotten, especially when it comes to things like UFOs or supposed videos of aliens, for example. I mean, we have all of these videos lately circulating online of UFOs and alleged footage of aliens or some sort of entities, and it's really gained a lot of traction. But at the same time, we don't know if what we're looking at is actually real or just AI generated. We can't trust our own senses anymore. Nobody knows if what they're looking at is actually reality or simply a distortion created by artificial intelligence. And this also applies to history, where, like I said, there are so many different perspectives right now on history. But on top of that, we also have to deal with AI falsifications. We have already seen examples of historical footage that has been distorted and altered by AI. And with no unified perspective of history, it's only a matter of time until nobody can even accurately remember the real history of anything. And on top of that, it's going to get muddied by fake historical videos that are indistinguishable from the original media from the time. Another thing that comes to my mind is the discourse around the boomer era. Many baby boomers like to claim they had it much harder and that young people today are just lazy and aren't working hard enough. Meanwhile, younger people argue that actually no, the boomers had it pretty good. They had better material conditions, a better economy, things were cheaper, and they actually had it far better than we do today. It seems like a lot of boomers have this false perception of their past, almost like they develop it out of some kind of narcissistic projection to claim that things were actually harder than they actually were. You know, you have boomers post things like, oh, we didn't have fast food growing up, even though most boomers grew up with fast food. Most boomers grew up with many of the amenities that we have today. And it's arguable that their lives were actually better than ours are now. And this is very similar to some of the themes we see in the movie, particularly when we have the arguments between Clark and Mary, where Clark refuses to take accountability for any of his personal issues. And at some points, it almost seems like Clark is intentionally misremembering the events that led to his wife kicking him out of the house. He misremembers his own problems from the past, refusing to acknowledge that maybe he was the problem all along. Whereas Mary, you could argue, reflects the younger generations calling out Clark for his BS, who in this case is symbolic of the boomers, and telling him that no, it is your fault and you need to acknowledge it. Now, I would even say that the Backrooms is not even a new concept. In a lot of ways, the Backrooms is simply a modern reinterpretation of previous mythological ideas, particularly the archetype of the labyrinth or the maze, which has existed in many cultures throughout the world since ancient times. Now, the labyrinth or maze is symbolic of the unconscious mind, or in Jungian terms, our shadow. Ancient stories involving traversing a maze often involved an individual physically entering and traversing through these structures, encountering different threats. By traveling through the labyrinth or the maze, One was symbolically and figuratively encountering and confronting the darker aspects of their unconscious mind in order to bring them to light. In arguably the most well-known maze myth, this being where the word labyrinth comes from, Theseus, a hero from the Greek city of Athens, enters the labyrinth of King Minos to slay a beast called the Minotaur. Many scholars argue that the Minotaur in this mythology is symbolic for the beastly, untamed nature of our psyche. When Theseus confronts the Minotaur, he is, on a symbolic level, confronting himself. He is confronting the darker aspects of his psyche, the more beastly, animalistic nature which exists inside of him and which exists inside of all of us. And in this way, the Backrooms could be a modern interpretation of Minos' labyrinth, with its contents of poorly remembered memories being representative of trauma stored in the unconscious mind. The monster, at the end of the film, being an amalgamation of Clark's worst personality traits, could be equated to the Minotaur, a physical manifestation of the more beastly, animalistic, and arguably evil parts of his psyche. However, unlike the labyrinth or the mazes of mythology, which had an exit, the backroom seems to stretch on indefinitely with no clear beginning or end. Unlike a traditional maze, the backrooms have no center. There is no clear destination, there is no exit, and there's no explanation. This reflects the major psychological shift which has occurred in Western society over the last century. For most of history, people believe that life and reality had a set purpose and a set destination. The world of our ancestors was one of mythology, divinity, purpose, prophecy, and cosmic order. Modern society, on the other hand, and the people living in it, increasingly struggle with finding any sense of meaning or order in life or reality. Through the destruction of our civilization, social norms, community, cultural identity, and religious foundations, life in the West has become increasingly meaningless and without any clear sense of direction or ultimate purpose. And in this way, the Backrooms perfectly represents modern society, being an endless maze of fragmented ideas and memories completely devoid of their original purposes or meaning. The Backrooms is a collection of half-remembered interpretations of much greater things. Much like how in the Backrooms we find distorted and half-remembered versions of things that exist in the real world, in the modern world today, we see distorted and half-remembered versions of previous institutions. If you just walk around, you can see that there's a stark contrast between the architecture of our ancestors and the more modern architecture, which can barely even capture the glory of these buildings that were built hundreds or even thousands of years ago. And the buildings of today do kind of resemble what we see in the Backrooms, just minimalist, meaningless, and without any real symmetry or logic in their design. And just like our architecture, the physical remnants of our past cultural institutions, such as the church, still exist today, but they are just half-remembered versions of something that was far greater. Like the Backrooms, our whole world is becoming a distorted perception of itself, lacking any sense of meaning, coherency, logic, or a sense of higher purpose. Like with the Backrooms lore, much of our media and our art has been reduced from something intelligent into low IQ slop. All of society right now is trapped inside of a metaphorical Backrooms. But unlike the Backrooms in the movie, we can't tell what's reality and what's the copy.